Hey everyone, welcome back to Deep Nonsense, the show where we peel back Hollywood's curtain, sometimes to fact check the impossible, and sometimes just to bask in the movie magic.
Now, you know us from our science meets cinema deep dives, such as Ghostbusters gear, RoboCop tech, even everlasting gobstoppers.
But today, it's time to go real deep, where we set aside the science and just dig into the heart of the film, the story, the characters, the themes, and those moments that just stick with you.
That's right. So cue the projector, dim the lights, pop up that popcorn, and let's dive real deep into RoboCop.
RoboCop. Oh
Yes.
man. So, what do you think about this film?
RoboCop is one of those movies that is so specific. People might disagree with this, but so specific genre wise, it stands on its own, if you ask me. You can talk about films, you can talk about science fiction films, you can talk about sort of action sci-fi films, which is, I think, probably the genre this is. But there's something so specific about this, particular for the time it was made, that I think sets it apart. But I think probably one of the things is a lot of people. This was hard R, right? This was hard R.
Very hard.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I remember the most about the impact people talked about with this film was sort of the trauma that's that some people came away with from this film. Now, was that your experience?
Oh, yeah. I saw this movie way too young. Like,
Okay, it was one
way
of
too
those.
young. Yeah, I was 9 when this film came out, and I have a distinct memory of seeing the trailers and thinking, "Oh, cool. He's like a superhero. This metal guy that has a gun in his leg, and he's like this super robot cop, right?" And I actually remember my uncle who he went to see him and my dad would go see movies occasionally, and I remember them coming back. I was at my grandma's house, and I was like, "Dad, what'd you go see?" And my uncle was like, "We went to see Robot Cop." He didn't even call it RoboCop. He called it Robot Cop for forever,
Oh
and
my
I
gosh.
I didn't put two and two together that the RoboCop that I saw on TV with the metal guy and the gun and all that was the movie that they saw. When he said Robot Cop, in my head, I pictured R2D2 that was all made out of silver with a police siren on his head. That's that was the Robot Cop that I had in my head as a 9-year-old, right?
He looked like a cybernetic minion. Okay, got it.
So, yes, pretty much. So flash forward 6 months, the movie comes out on video,
You're still 9.
and yeah, I'm 10 at this point. The
Okay, so
movie's on
10.
home video,
You've made the decade.
and my neighbors rented it, and we watched it at their house. Like, and I did not know that it was as hard of an R rating as it is. Um, Turns out we watched the TV version that they put on TV with they recorded it and cut the commercials out. So that's
Oh,
that's the reason I was able to see it was that there were no cuss words in it. All the
right.
really super violent stuff was cut out, but I still was so traumatized by this movie because two scenes in particular. There is the scene where they're testing out the Ed 209, which is
Hmm,
the enforcement droid series 209, which
right.
is this giant tank with legs basically that has machine guns for hands. And there's a scene where they're in the boardroom and they're doing a demonstration and they hand a gun to an executive and says, point it at the robot. And they point it at the robot and the robot's like, "Whoa, you're in violation of a law. You put down the weapon. You have 10 seconds to comply, whatever." So the executive's like, "You better do what he says." And he takes the gun and throws it away. And the robot doesn't turn itself off. It's still like, "You have 8 seconds to comply." And he's like running around the room panicking because this thing is like, you know what I mean?
Because
And
he knows what's about to happen.
I know what's about to happen as a 10-year-old, and I'm freaking out like
And you can't
that.
take
Yes,
it.
he does get shot, and he gets shot multiple times and dies. And my 10-year-old brain was like, "What did I just see?" Okay, fine. We'll move on to the rest of the story. Goes through. There's this cop named Alex Murphy who gets reassigned to one of the worst parts of Detroit, and him and his partner are chasing down a couple of bad guys that just robbed a bank, and they chase him into this steel mill. And rather than wait for backup, they decide to go in and handle this on their own, which, first of all, is stupid.
Stupid, right?
Two cops going after like six guys. They go in there, they get into it with them. Uh, they end up getting cornered. Alex Murphy ends up getting murdered by this gang of people in a very, very brutal fashion. Now, I did not see the brutal part of it, like, because it was
Because of the
TV.
TV cut,
Yeah,
right?
because of the TV cut, but it was still, he was just a police officer doing his job, and he was trapped by these dudes, and like they shot his hand off and they murdered him. And then, because he was borderline dead when the ambulance came to take him away, he was the perfect candidate for the RoboCop program, and like they basically turned him into a machine. I guess they took his brain and his face and built a robot around it, right? So that's the crux of the story. But those two scenes in particular just traumatized the hell out of me as a kid, and I still, to this day, like, I bought the film, or I watched that TV version. I mean, I did like the movie a lot, but those two
Mhm.
scenes used to be pretty traumatic for me. And when I bought the DVD to watch the actual, like, real R-rated version, I was kind of
Right.
blown away by how violent it actually was. Like, you actually see his hand getting blown off by a shotgun, which is great practical effects work,
Yeah, I mean,
you
right.
know? There's there's amazing practical effects work because, um, I have the Blu-ray that has the quote unquote X-rated version, which is the director's cut, which includes there's a scene where when they do the coup de grace and they kill Peter Weller's character, it is a full body mock-up of the upper body of Peter Weller in like this pose where he's in agony, and his face shows it, and his body is kind of rocking back and forth, and the camera goes past him and like comes around the back, so that you basically start POV of the bad guy, go towards him, and it swings around to the backside, and then you see the bad guy pointing the shotgun at his head, and he pulls the trigger, and the back of his head explodes, and the dummy falls over. Right. So ostensibly, you're watching this single shot of the character like in pain as the camera goes around behind his head, and then the back of his head explodes. Like, that's a complex shot to do in
It is, that's
1987,
right, yeah.
and it is worth watching just for the amazing, like, mock-up of his upper body. Like, that piece of practical effects is up there in the top pantheon for me of, like, a piece of cinema. It's so well done. It's so well done that they had to cut it out of the movie because it looked so real. And, when I bought that Blu-ray, I remember watching that scene a couple of times just for the sheer impressiveness of the practical effects. But it still haunts me. Like, that whole idea of, you know, dying in the line of duty just because you're trying to do a job, just it
Right.
still haunts me to this day. I watched the movie 2 weeks ago, in preparation for doing this podcast, and I was still had like just the tiniest little bit of PTSD going into watching the movie. Like, okay, 47-year-old man, you can do this. You're not 10 years old anymore. And it's true. It's not as traumatic now as it was back then, but man, there's a really good PSA for not letting your kids watch movies too young,
Too young. I would
you
absolutely
know?
agree with that. There's a there's an age at which their maturity, and the ability for their brain to process the real and the fictional, they need to reach that point before
Yeah.
before they are introduced to something, that potentially may, scar them for life. But
Yep.
what I was gonna mention in a previous episode, in our Ghostbusters episode, we had a conversation that was similar with regard to practical effects, and you talked about your first legit jump scare. And this movie is interesting in terms RoboCop is interesting in terms of for your experience for it, because there was one very, very intense experience with Ghostbusters for you that turned out to be a positive, "I want more of that, I wanna learn more about that."
Mhm.
And then with RoboCop, you've got another intense experience that left a much more, traumatic sort of impression upon you, still knowing the difference between the fact that this is movie magic, but it was the way in which it was done. Granted, Ghostbusters is an action comedy where this is just an action drama, if you want to put it that way, sci-fi action drama.
Sure.
How do you differentiate the way in which those experiences hit you, not because one's a comedy and one's not, but the way that they were shot, the visual language that impressed what it impressed on you?
I wow. That's crazy because watching the quote unquote X-rated version of the film almost makes the first scene where Ed 209 and the guy in the boardroom, that turns it into a comedic spectacle because they cut about 10 seconds out of that scene as well,
Mhm.
because Ed 209 turns on him and fires the machine gun, and he goes flying backwards and lands on the model of Delta City, which is what they're trying to replace old Detroit with. And as he's laying there on the model, the Ed 209 just keeps firing for like 10 seconds and turns this dude into ground beef. And it's firing so much, so it's so over the top that it almost becomes comedic. And so that did something different on that scene, having watched the the director's cut. But still, the scene where Alex Murphy gets killed and becomes the ideal candidate for becoming RoboCop. The only thing that did for me was say in my mind, okay, I'm not going to be a police officer. Like,
That one's not for me.
it was not for me. And I think that's a big difference, because a police officer getting killed in the line of duty can happen. Somebody making a laser throwing backpack to catch a ghost, that's
At
not
least as of
real.
now, right, we don't possess that technology. Well,
Right.
and as you say, the brutality of it, that's the other thing that
Yeah.
is in that scene you're describing. One, the anticipation of what's about to happen because you
Mhm.
can see it coming, right?
Yeah.
And the adeptness of both the director and the cinematographer in telling that story visually.
Mhm.
But here's what we want to move on to next, because obviously this is a movie that has stayed with you. You continue to
Yeah.
watch it.
Yeah.
What's your fist pump moment for this film? So, where do we get redemption for his character? What's the moment where you go and you're like, I'm waiting for this moment in the film because this is what makes that other scene worth it.
It's the last line of the movie. Like, the
Give it to
very,
us. Give it
very
to us,
end of the
baby.
movie before the credits roll. For the whole movie, after he becomes RoboCop, he's having these, like, little flashes of scenes from his life. He sees, like, him walking into the bedroom and talking to his wife, or him talking to his son, and they're just little almost like glitches, like his memory is glitching, and he doesn't know who he is, but he runs into his old partner who tells him that his name was Alex Murphy and that he used to be a cop, and, like, basically he gets to a point where the city turns on RoboCop, and she has to get him in a car and get him out of there, and he's like been shot by, like, every police officer in the city, has unloaded every clip they have into him and injured RoboCop, basically. So he's at this steel mill, and it's ironically the same steel mill where he was murdered, fixing himself, and it's the first time he takes his helmet off. You see what RoboCop looks like without the helmet, which is just like the flesh peel, like, stuck on the metal skeleton that looks like Alex Murphy's face. And his main objective is to shut down the guy that tried to kill him, and he was actually recording the conversation, and he's like, this guy made a mistake. Now it's time to erase that mistake. And he's got that replaying in his head that this is the guy that's trying to kill him. But he's also inserted a part of his prime directive. One of the things he can't do is arrest a senior executive of the company that made him. So
Convenient.
the whole climax of the film has him going back to the company's headquarters, walking into the boardroom when they're having discussion, and he plays the like video that's been recorded in his head of basically the guy saying what he said before he tried to kill him, and it gets him fired. And the he panics and like puts a gun to the CEO's head, and the CEO's like, "You're fired," and RoboCop's like, "Thank you," and he shoots him, right, and he goes out the window and he falls to his death, and the CEO of the company was like, "Nice shooting, son. What's your name?" And he turns around, looks at the camera, and goes, "Murphy," and then just like turns and walks out. And that's the end of the film. Like, he finally comes to terms with the fact that he was Alex Murphy. He admits the fact that he was, he knows who he was. And I just think that that's really cool. And that's how the film ended. And that's the big redemption moment that gets me cheering every time I watch that film.
I like it, man. There's a whole sort of death and resurrection motif going there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that you mention, and we'll get just a touch philosophical here for a second. You mentioned that he's killed by criminals before he becomes RoboCop, right? In
Mhm.
a particularly brutal way. And then near the end of the film, at this point, the people that are shooting at him are law enforcement. And so that this guy whose only objective in life as an adult had been to, we'll simplify and say, protect and serve.
Mhm.
First, the criminal element nearly kills him. And
Yeah.
then after the fact, then he's pursued by the law element.
Mhm.
And what do you think? Do you think the writers had anything particular in mind there when they were trying to put some subtext about the well, and a large part of it, I guess, probably has something to do with the corporate element. So maybe not just law, but the corporate element controlling certain certain entities within society. They're supposed to be free from influence that is monetary or things like that. So, what do you think about that? On one hand, we have the criminals trying to kill him, and then on the other hand, we have law enforcement trying to kill him.
I think the whole film is just like an allegory for how bad capitalism can get,
Okay,
because the corporation is the end all be all. They own the police, so
exactly.
it's like they take this guy who is a police officer, and there's like a line in the movie that was like, "Oh no, he signed the paperwork when he signed up. We can do whatever we want to him." You know? And it's like, he's dead. But he's not dead, obviously, if you're bringing him back,
And they own
so
him. That's the
yeah, and
whole
they
thing,
own
right?
him. So it's like, once you quote unquote die, they can take your brain and put it in a machine and tell you to, like, he's still trapped in there, and it's horrific to think about that. Not
Yeah.
only did he go through this traumatic death, but when they brought him back to life, now he's a slave to being a cop, and it's like, I don't know. There's just something really awful in this in the subtext of this film
There
that
is, yeah.
just bugs me, and it also bugs me because I feel like it's way, way, way ahead of its time, because we're entering this era where corporations are so powerful, and CEOs of corporations are joining in with the government to try to shape
Mhm.
things their
That's
way,
right,
and
yeah.
it's just kind of terrifying. And it was way, way ahead of its time, which, you know Paul Verhoeven as a director, man, he's got a trilogy of films that I just absolutely love: RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers. They
Yeah.
all have sort of a subverted way of telling the story. Like with RoboCop, there's a whole lot of like fake commercials and fake TV shows and newscasts, and like, it just shows you how bleak the world is by doing a mundane thing like newscasts and commercials. And same thing with, Starship Troopers is very, very fascist. Like, there's a lot
Right.
of fascist imagery, and it's I don't know. The guy was a brilliant filmmaker. He really was, and he's way ahead of his time with this film.
I think one of the things it speaks to is that, and again, just kind of thinking about it maybe at a slightly deeper level, this is deep nonsense.
Yeah.
The idea that art does have the ability, if we pay attention, to communicate things that are, commentary on our both our past, our present, and our potential future. Um, if we pay attention to what the artists are saying through a lot of those films, music, you name the medium, there's a possibility for us as as a people, as a race, to be able to take those lessons and then reconfigure the way we approach the world and make better decisions. What's interesting is it seems like, for the most part, we ignore them.
Yeah, 'cause it's
And
just popcorn fodder, right?
exactly, right. But I think that what that also speaks to is the importance of artists continuing to make the content that can communicate those things in the wrappers in which people can digest them, regardless of how many people actually respond in a way that is productive and positive. And
Yeah,
so a movie like that, you were talking about there being a bleakness to it, but the bleakness, of course, is on purpose. We need to see what the end result is of a certain path. And sometimes, in order to do that, you need a hard arm movie where a guy gets shot to death in the back of the head.
that's true. That is true. I feel like that's a good spot to wrap up.
I think that's a good spot to wrap it up.
Yeah, yeah. All right, then I guess that wraps up our real deep on RoboCop. I do hope you enjoyed hanging out in the cinematic trenches with us.
Now, if you're loving this format, drop us a review, hit subscribe, and share with your fellow movie buffs, but not in the buff necessarily.
Next time, we'll be back in the lab pondering whether or not we could actually use the same shrinking technology that they used in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Ant-Man, which that's going to be interesting, talking about two movies at once, two completely different movies at once with the same type of technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. And I think that I think you as listeners will find some of the technology in those movies, both that's completely fictional and, believe it or not, that's actually being developed, kind of mind blowing. So thanks for listening to Deep Nonsense, and we'll see
See you
you
on
on
the
the
next
next reel.
reel.